This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
Though retired from the pulpit, Pastor Elijah was still a fixture of the Alabama neighborhood. Steady, dependable, always present. He no longer preached each Sunday, but children still gathered each week for Bible study, Bibles tucked under their arms, waiting for the man who never failed to show up. It was their rhythm, the scrape of shoes against gravel, the hum of cicadas in the heavy evening air, the smell of suppers drifting from kitchens, porch lights glowing to life as daylight faded. And at the center of it all was Elijah, punctual, faithful, never late. But tonight, the door stayed closed. At first, the waiting seemed harmless. A few children whispered that maybe he was finishing a prayer. Others traced lines in the dust, glancing at the parsonage next door, hoping for a shadow to cross the window. But as the minutes stretched into nearly an hour, the lightness drained away. What had begun as laughter faded into unease. Parents soon stepped onto porches, watching the church steps and the house beside it. His car was in its place. The porch light blinked faintly against the darkening sky. Yet no sound, no movement, no sign of life stirred within. One mother crossed the street and knocked at his door. Once, then again louder. "Pastor Elijah?" she called. Nothing. Only the rustle of leaves replied. The house felt sealed in stillness, as if holding its breath. For years, he had been the one they could rely on. Retirement hadn't changed that. He still visited the sick, still counseled neighbors on his porch, still opened the church for the children without fail. To find him absent now, without reason, without word, unsettled everyone watching. The children shifted nervously. A boy tugged at the church door, but it was locked. He frowned, muttering in frustration, and the others fell silent, sensing in his tone the weight of something they could not name. Neighbors whispered possibilities. Perhaps he was resting. Perhaps he had taken ill. Perhaps he had simply forgotten, though forgetting was never in his nature. Elijah lived by habit, by patterns, by duty. His absence was louder than any sound, and while he was respected and loved, he carried an air of solitude, as though part of his life remained quietly out of reach. A silence no one questioned, until now. By nightfall, the children were led home, their Bibles clutched tightly in their hands. Parents lingered on porches, staring at the parsonage across the street, caught between the urge to knock again and the dread of what might lie behind the door. Something was wrong. Everyone knew it. The man who had guided so many lives was gone, and the weight of his silence pressed down on the neighborhood. Elijah's story began long before that quiet Alabama night. In the early 1980s, when he was barely out of college and still in his early 20s, he stood at the pulpit for the very first time. The sanctuary was small then, a country church with creaking wooden pews and paint peeling from the windowsills. But Elijah's voice carried with unusual strength. He spoke of hope, of duty, of sacrifice. His words had the urgency of youth and the weight of conviction. And from that moment, the course of his life was set. For 3 decades, he gave everything to the church. Through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, he was always there. At the hospital bedside of the dying, at the graveside of the grieving, in the pulpit every Sunday morning. rain or shine. He was the kind of pastor who remembered anniversaries, who showed up unasked when tragedy struck, who carried the private burdens of his congregation in silence. By the time he reached his 50s, no one in the community could remember a time when Pastor Elijah had not been there. And yet, behind the faith in the service, something deeper stirred, something he never spoke aloud. Elijah was gay, quietly, privately, in the solitude of his own heart. He knew it. But in the South, in the decades when his ministry had begun, that truth was a dangerous one. He kept it hidden, burying it beneath sermons and scripture, allowing his life to be defined entirely by service. In 2017, at just 52, Elijah shocked his congregation by stepping down. It wasn't age that pulled him away. It wasn't scandal or burnout. It was something quieter, more personal. After 30 years of giving himself wholly to God, he wanted to live, even if just for a little while, for himself. Neighbors saw him smile more after retirement. He tended a small garden behind the parsonage, planting roses along the fence line. He still led Wednesday evening Bible studies for children, but the weight of weekly sermons was gone. For the first time in his adult life, Elijah allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to be loved, not as a pastor, not as a symbol, but as a man. In late 2020, with the world locked down, Elijah quietly opened his heart. He met a younger man from Birmingham, vibrant, full of the freedom Elijah had denied himself for decades. It was not a marriage, not even something the community around him would have recognized. But for Elijah, it was the beginning of something he had always longed for: companionship, affection, love. The relationship remained private, unspoken. Neighbors saw only the same steady man they had always known. Through 2021 and into 2022, nothing seemed unusual. Elijah still walked to the corner store for groceries. He still visited church friends who called on him. He still sat on his porch in the evenings, a Bible in his lap, nodding at neighbors as they passed. His life from the outside appeared steady and predictable. But under the surface, a quiet shift was taking place. Elijah was allowing himself to feel, to open doors he had kept shut for more than 30 years. To the world, he was still the retired pastor who had given decades to God. But in private, he was finally beginning to dedicate his days to himself. It was in many ways a safe illusion, a calm picture of faith, routine, and devotion. The community believed they knew him completely. They trusted the rhythms of his life as if they were permanent. And yet behind that calm, there were new choices being made. Choices about love, about identity, about the man Elijah longed to be. But illusions never last, and Elijah's was already beginning to crack. In the months after retirement, Elijah seemed lighter. The pulpit's burden was gone, and in private, the companionship he found brought a joy he had long buried. From the outside, his life looked calm, but beneath that calm, threads were beginning to fray. The first sign came in early 2021. Neighbors noticed Elijah wasn't as punctual as he once was. A man who had built his reputation on reliability. The pastor who was always early for funerals, who never missed a prayer meeting, who could be counted on without fail, was suddenly slipping. A Bible study would begin 10 minutes late. A hospital visit he had promised never happened. People excused it at first, telling themselves retirement had loosened his schedule. But for those who had known him best, the changes felt strange. By spring, there were whispers. Some said Elijah looked tired, distracted. Others noticed how often he slipped away, driving his car toward Birmingham and returning late into the night. He offered no explanation, only a polite smile when asked, as though brushing aside curiosity with the grace of habit. Behind closed doors, Elijah's search for love was both gift and weight. It gave him warmth he had craved for decades. But every moment was shadowed by secrecy. He was not open about who he truly was. The fear of being discovered lingered in every choice, every whispered conversation, every visit disguised as something else. And secrecy breeds tension. By summer 2021, arguments had begun to creep into what had once felt like sanctuary. Small things at first, a missed call, a canceled evening, suspicions that went unspoken but never fully left the air. Elijah had given 30 years of his life to others. Now, in trying to claim something for himself, he found that even love carried risks. To his congregation and neighbors, none of this was visible. They still saw the man sitting on his porch with a Bible in hand, waving gently as people passed. But they also noticed other changes. He no longer joined community dinners with the same eagerness. He seemed more withdrawn. His sermons, when he filled in as a guest preacher, carried an unusual weight, darker, more reflective, as though drawn from a place of struggle rather than peace. One friend recalled Elijah once saying, almost in passing, "Sometimes the truth we hide has a way of finding its own voice." It was dismissed at the time as a pastor's wisdom, but in hindsight, it sounded more like a confession. Then one night in late 2021, a neighbor paused on the sidewalk, startled by raised voices spilling from the parsonage. Sharp, unfamiliar, nothing like Elijah's gentle tone. By the next morning, the house was quiet again, the curtains drawn. When asked, Elijah smiled politely and said he hadn't been feeling well. The explanation satisfied no one, but the subject was dropped. By 2022, the pattern was undeniable. Trips to Birmingham grew more frequent. Nights of silence grew longer. Friends noticed Elijah seemed thinner, his face more drawn, as if carrying a stress he would not share. His smile, once warm and easy, now felt practiced, and still he kept up appearances. The Bible studies continued. The porch light still glowed at dusk. The children still gathered at the church, trusting him as they always had. To the outside world, Elijah's life seemed intact, but those closest to him could sense what others could not. Something was wrong. The man who had given decades to God and finally dared to claim love for himself was no longer at peace. The illusion of safety was splintering, and the cracks were widening toward a breaking point no one could yet see. By the summer of 2022, Elijah's life looked as if it was balanced on a knife's edge. To his neighbors, nothing had changed. He still opened the church doors on Wednesdays for children's Bible study. He still waved from his porch with the faintest of smiles. His garden was trimmed, his roses blooming along the fence line. Yet beneath this picture of calm, Elijah's private life had become a tangle of secrecy, longing, and tension. The man he had met in Birmingham had grown closer to him, slipping in and out of Elijah's quiet routines. At first, their companionship was simple: dinners, conversations, long drives away from the gaze of neighbors. But over time, the dynamic shifted. Love, Elijah had hoped, would bring him peace. Instead, it brought complications. The younger man was vibrant, restless, and unlike Elijah in every way. He wanted more time, more commitment, more openness. Elijah, bound by decades of habit and the unspoken fear of exposure, struggled to give that. Arguments flared, sharp words behind drawn curtains. What had begun as the answer to years of loneliness became a source of unease, one Elijah tried to hide from the community that still saw him as steady and whole. On the morning of August 14, 2022, Elijah followed the same ritual he always had. He brewed coffee in the small kitchen of the parsonage, watered his roses, and waved to a neighbor walking her dog. To anyone watching, it was just another day, but inside, unease was already brewing. The night before, he and his partner had argued again. Voices rose, accusations flew, and Elijah had retreated into silence. By mid-afternoon, the tension returned. His partner arrived at the parsonage. The air between them charged before a word was spoken. The blinds were drawn. The porch light clicked on early, though the sun was still bright outside. What happened inside those walls could never be fully reconstructed, but investigators later pieced together fragments of the truth. Words gave way to shouting. Shouting gave way to confrontation. The man Elijah had trusted, the one he believed would bring him love after decades of loneliness, now stood as the embodiment of betrayal. Elijah had uncovered the truth. The man he thought was his future carried another family in Birmingham, a secret that shattered everything. For Elijah, who had sacrificed so much of himself for the sake of others, the discovery struck like a physical blow. The house filled with the heat of August, the sound of cicadas outside, the stillness of neighbors unaware just steps away. Inside, the confrontation reached its breaking point. The conflict turned violent. It was quick, shocking, brutal. Neighbors later recalled hearing something, a thud, perhaps, or the faint sound of a raised voice. but no one could place it clearly. By evening, the parsonage was still once more, its windows dark, its door locked. The act itself left the house marked forever. Elijah's life, built on 30 years of faith and quiet devotion, was ended in a moment of betrayal. The man who had guided so many lives, who had finally dared to reach for love, was gone. In the immediate aftermath, the suspect did not flee in haste. Instead, investigators believe he lingered, moving through the rooms as if erasing traces, as if wrestling with what had just taken place. A glass sat rinsed in the sink. Curtains were pulled tight, and the porch light, strangely left on, glowed against the night, as if mocking the emptiness inside. When he finally left, the parsonage stood as it always had, neat, quiet, undisturbed. From the outside, nothing looked amiss. Children still lingered on the church steps that evening, waiting for Elijah to appear. Parents still glanced across the street, expecting to see the familiar figure walking toward the church door. But inside, the breaking point had already come. By nightfall, the stillness was complete. The house that had always been open, the man who had always been present, now held only absence. A life given to God, and briefly, courageously to love, had been cut short by betrayal within his own walls. The neighborhood sensed it before they knew it. Something was wrong. The door that always opened remained locked. The light that usually comforted now glowed like a signal of unease. The pastor who never missed a lesson had vanished. No one outside knew it yet, but the crime was already sealed within those walls, hidden for only a moment longer. On the evening of August 14, 2022, the neighborhood still believed Elijah would appear. Children lingered on the church steps longer than usual, their Bibles pressed against their laps. Parents coaxed them home one by one, promising the pastor would explain everything the following week. But by nightfall, unease had taken root. By the next morning, whispers spread across the block. It wasn't like Elijah to disappear. He had lived in the parsonage for years. His routines were steady, predictable. A missing Bible study was unusual, but not alarming on its own. But when no one saw him the following day, tension grew thicker. On August 15th, a church member decided to check. She knocked at his door, called his name, even circled the house, peering through windows. Everything looked neat and untouched. His car was still in the drive, curtains still drawn, the porch light still burning, even in daylight, flickered faintly. She left uneasy, carrying with her the weight of something she could not explain. By the second day, August 16th, calls went unanswered. The church phone rang without reply. Neighbors grew restless. One finally called law enforcement, not with the certainty of a crime, but with the dread that something was wrong. When deputies arrived, the house was quiet, locked from the inside. They knocked and announced themselves. No answer. The decision was made to force entry. What they found inside would ripple through the community like an earthquake. The discovery was devastating. Pastor Elijah, the man who had been at the center of their lives for 30 years, was gone. The details of the scene were too raw for the neighbors who gathered outside to comprehend. Deputies moved in and out, their faces grim, their words clipped. Yellow tape stretched across the lawn, fluttering in the hot August air. A once ordinary house was now marked as a place of violence. For the children, the shock was incomprehensible. Just days earlier, they had sat waiting for him to appear with his familiar, gentle smile. Now the church steps were empty, and whispers filled the playgrounds and sidewalks. Pastor Elijah is dead. Parents struggled for words, caught between explaining and protecting. The adults carried their own grief. For years, Elijah had been more than a pastor. He was the man who prayed with them in hospital rooms, who sat quietly with them after funerals, who checked in when their marriages faltered. His absence now felt like a hole punched through the heart of the community. Vigils formed almost immediately. Candles lit outside the church, prayers whispered under a heavy sky. Law enforcement faced the challenge of sorting fact from rumor. Early impressions left questions unanswered. There was no forced entry, no sign of burglary, nothing stolen. The home seemed intact, almost ordinary except for what had happened inside. Investigators began combing through Elijah's life, To many, he had seemed solitary, devoted, almost without complication. But detectives soon realized there was more to his story. By August 17, the case was already drawing wider attention. Local media reported on the sudden death of a retired pastor, focusing on his decades of service and the shock to the congregation. News anchors spoke with soft tones, standing outside the church where mourners left flowers at the steps. Reporters interviewed neighbors who described him as kind, gentle, and dependable. But beneath the grief, questions began to rise. Why had no one seen him for days? Who had been in and out of his home? What did his last days look like? The investigation pressed forward. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking about visitors, about arguments, about anything unusual. It was then that a few neighbors, hesitant at first, mentioned late-night voices, raised tones from inside the parsonage. A car from Birmingham spotted more than once. A sense of tension that had never quite reached the surface until now. In the days that followed, grief turned to unease. Elijah's death was no longer simply a tragedy, it was a mystery. The man who had spent his life serving others now seemed to have been carrying secrets no one had dared to imagine. Community vigils swelled larger, drawing not only church members but strangers who had heard the story on the news. People prayed, sang hymns, and left flowers, their candles glowing long into the humid summer nights. Children held hands, parents wept openly, and neighbors exchanged looks of disbelief. For many, it felt like the world had shifted on its axis, as though someone they thought they knew had been taken by a darkness they could not explain. The media, meanwhile, leaned into the mystery. Headlines spoke of a beloved pastor found dead in his own home, of unanswered questions, of a community in shock. Television cameras lingered on the flickering porch light, now extinguished, as if it were a symbol of the absence he left behind. Behind the scenes, investigators began focusing on one path. Elijah's personal life, once invisible to the community, was slowly coming into view. But for the neighbors who had waited with their children on the church steps just days before, the truth hardly mattered yet. All they knew was that Elijah, the steady presence of their lives, was gone, and nothing would ever feel the same again. In the days following August 14, 2022, the parsonage remained wrapped in yellow tape, a stark reminder that something unthinkable had shattered the calm of the neighborhood. Investigators worked quietly inside, piecing together timelines, studying the scene, searching for any clue that would explain how a man so loved, so steady, could meet such an end. At first, suspicion cast a wide net. The house showed no forced entry. Nothing was stolen. To detectives, this suggested Elijah had known the person who ended his life. But who? To the community, he seemed to live alone. His routines left no room for strangers. His car rarely left the neighborhood, except for the occasional trips toward Birmingham. It was those trips that first drew attention. Detectives spoke with neighbors who recalled the sight of another car, unfamiliar, sometimes parked discreetly at odd hours. A few even remembered hearing voices inside the parsonage late at night. Sometimes laughter, sometimes raised tones. One neighbor admitted, hesitantly, that she had once paused on the sidewalk, surprised by the sound of an argument sharp enough to cut through the walls. Investigators pulled phone records, tracing calls and messages Elijah had exchanged in the weeks leading up to his death. And there, the first crack widened into a revelation. One name surfaced again and again. A younger man from Birmingham named Derek. His number appeared dozens of times in Elijah's call log. Late-night conversations, text messages, and a pattern of communication that grew more intense as the summer pressed on. When detectives followed the trail, a picture began to emerge. Elijah had been in a relationship, private and guarded, with Derek for nearly 2 years. To the congregation, to the neighbors, to the community that thought they knew every piece of his life, it was a revelation. For Elijah, who had given 30 years to God and only recently dared to live for himself, Derek represented both freedom and risk. Investigators learned of dinners shared in Birmingham, of long drives away from prying eyes, of visits to the parsonage under the cover of night. But they also uncovered something darker. Derek had another family in Birmingham, a life hidden in shadows, colliding fatally with the one he shared with Elijah. The discovery explained the tension neighbors had overheard, the late-night arguments, the drawn curtains, the unease Elijah carried in his final months. Elijah, who had once lived by patterns of discipline and service, had uncovered betrayal in the very love he thought would redeem his solitude. When detectives brought Derek in for questioning, the unraveling accelerated. At first, he denied knowing Elijah beyond casual acquaintance, but phone records, messages, and witnesses told a different story. Confronted with evidence, his demeanor shifted. What emerged was not a story of random violence, but of love soured by secrecy and betrayal. In time, law enforcement confirmed what the community could not bear to imagine. Derek was the man Elijah had trusted, the man who entered his home freely, the man whose double life had turned deadly. When Derek was charged, the courtroom became the final stage of revelation. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, the phone records, the witness accounts, the timeline of that August day. They spoke of Elijah's dedication to faith, his longing for love, and the devastating betrayal that ended his life. The defense tried to paint another picture, of tempers flaring, of emotions spiraling out of control, of a man caught between two worlds. But the weight of the evidence pressed heavily. Through it all, Elijah's legacy hung in the air. Friends and congregants filled the benches, their grief spilling into every silence. They struggled to reconcile the man they had known for decades with the hidden story now laid bare before the court. In the end, the verdict confirmed what many had already sensed. Elijah's life had been taken by the very man he trusted most. Derek, once a shadow at the edges of Elijah's world, now stood fully exposed. For the community, the truth was both devastating and clarifying. It explained the cracks, the whispers, the unease. It gave shape to the silence that had pressed down on them since that first night. But it also left behind a deeper wound. The knowledge that Elijah's final act of courage, to seek love after decades of solitude, had been met not with tenderness, but with betrayal. The unraveling was complete. The illusion was gone. And the truth Elijah had carried alone for decades now stood exposed before everyone. Elijah's story is one of devotion, longing, and betrayal. For 30 years, he gave everything he had to God and to the people who depended on him. He stood behind pulpits, sat at hospital bedsides, prayed with the grieving, and built a life of steady service. Yet when the sermons ended and the congregation went home, he lived with a silence few could see, a silence that hid his true self. When he retired in 2017, Elijah finally allowed himself a different dream. He wanted love, not as a pastor, not as a symbol, but as a man. For a brief time, he found it. In private moments, he opened his heart in ways he had never dared before. It was a quiet act of courage, one that came decades too late, but one he embraced nonetheless. But the very thing he longed for became the path to his undoing. In Derek, Elijah found companionship, but also deception. In reaching for freedom, he stepped into betrayal. And when the truth surfaced, it ended not only his life, but the fragile illusion of safety the community believed in for so long. There is a broader truth in this tragedy. Secrets have weight. Silence, however noble it seems, can become a prison, and love, when built on shadows, can turn from refuge into danger. Elijah's story is not just about a crime. It is about the human cost of hidden lives, of trust broken, of longing unfulfilled. Yet his legacy should not be remembered only by the way it ended. Elijah was a man who gave decades to others, who planted seeds of faith in children, who carried the burdens of countless families. He was a man who finally dared, even briefly, to live for himself. And his story leaves us with a haunting reminder that the truths we hide eventually find their way into the light. The truth Elijah had carried in silence for decades was finally exposed, for all to see. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that uncover the hidden truths behind the lives we think we know. And above all, remember Elijah, not just for how he died, but for how he lived.